This is a review of the concept of surplus and the graph that I have in Chapter 6. The idea of surplus is that in the economic models we look at, we're going to switch to one product in the graph, quantity measured on the horizontal axes, price and dollar amount measured on the vertical axes. The consumers in a competitive market pay the price determined by where the supply and the demand curve intersect. In this case, $5, quantity Q0. The consumer's demand curve represents the value that consumers put on different units. And the whole premise of a competitive market model is different consumers in the market value the same product differently. So if this price up here is something like $10 and the demand is positive, it means somebody in this economy values this product at $10. But in the competitive market, it's that last unit that determines the price, so everybody pays $5, including the person who thinks it's worth $10. They get the additional benefit. That, by the nature of how we draw the demand curve, means that there is an addition to this economy of having this product available, the price determined by the competitive market forces, the quantity determined by the competitive forces, gives an additional benefit to the economy above what it would be if we just stacked up the resources we use to produce it. So the definition is the difference between what they would be willing to pay, which is the demand curve representation, and the price line over the quantities which are consumed. The second part of this is producer surplus. And maybe this is a new definition of the supply curve for you. But basically it says here where these intersect that this is the quantity that this market is willing to supply if I can guarantee where the price is $5. Well, the fact that this supply curve is all below that $5 mark means that there are producers out there who would be willing to supply at least up to this amount or this last unit at something like $4 because they can produce it for $4 or less. So the supply curve is informing us that different producers can produce this product at different prices. And the market forces will drive the price to the point where there's a production supplied at a price which is equal to a demand quantity at that price. So what producers get is $5. What it costs them to make that product is represented by the supply curve. Therefore, there's an addition, a surplus above what it costs them to make it between the price line and the supply curve. Why don't we call this profit? One of the reasons is because this is actually the variable cost, and whether you produce 0 or 100, you have some fixed cost, and therefore the additional unit only adds the variable cost, which is captured by the supply curve. Again, if you've done your micro, this should have been part of what you were doing, and if you have some questions about it, I recommend you go back and look at a micro book under consumer and producer surplus. The net effect is that without trade in the economy, the benefit from having a competitive market is that, yes, the consumers pay for the product, the producers do use resources to pay to make the product, but the economy collectively gains the area, the surplus, the benefit represented in the triangles between the supply and demand curve. And that surplus benefit is divided between consumers, in this case the yellow triangle with F, and producers, which is really the whole green triangle, everything below the line, but we use the dividing that section for convenience because momentarily when we introduce it for trade, some of the producer surplus is going to be divided up and actually be handed back to consumers. And that can be seen in this picture which represents the story of surplus when you have international trade. Now the world price is $4. In a competitive market, if it was closed and somebody hollered out, I'll sell it to you for $4, then the demand would be quite large. The supply would be restricted by the supply curve given rational decision by producers, and the price would be bid up by those consumers who think it's worth more than $4 but can't buy it because there's nobody out there selling it. You don't need that process if you open it up to free trade. If you open up to free trade and the price is hollered out $4, the demand is exactly what the demand curve will tell us. So in this case, the producers rationally will not produce more than 75 because no one in this economy can produce it a 76th unit or more for $4 or less. The max they can produce for $4 or less is 75. The additional units the consumers want will be supplied, but it'll be supplied by foreign producers, so they will be imports. If the definition of consumer surplus is from the price line out to the demand curve and up, then you have the whole yellow triangle is consumer surplus. F was consumer surplus closed economy. A was producer surplus, but since the price fell, the consumers pay less to get the same benefit. That's also true for N. B and C are new surplus. B was not surplus before because it was under the demand supply curve, which meant it wasn't additional. You paid for it and you got the benefit. So it was just an exchange of wages and capital versus profits or revenue not profits, but revenue. And C is surplus that the consumers get because they get to buy these additional units. Following through with this, the idea of adding a tariff sort of redivides up the areas again. We'll notice that F is still part of consumer. When you have a tariff, in this case, the world price is $4, the tariff is 50 cents. In this economy, the price of the product is going to be $4.50. Why? Because the imported units are going to have a price tag of $4.50. $4 go to the foreign producers, 50 cents goes to the government in tariff. Well, the producers who are producing at home are not going to say, oh, okay, I'll put $4 on mine. They don't have to. They can charge $4.50, and therefore they're going to. And that also is going to increase the supply in the market. Before, at $4, only 75 were produced, but now there were some producers who couldn't justify producing at $4. But if the domestic price is $4.50 and it all goes to them, they will increase their production. So we get domestic production at 85, we get domestic consumption at 120. Again, that goes down because all of the units are going to be on sale for $4.50, whether they're imported or produced at home. And the demand curve says the maximum that will be demanded at that is 120. So therefore, we have a slightly new scenario. The producer surplus is going to be this area labeled H. And in fact, that's going to come back. The area labeled A that was consumer surplus with free trade is now going to be incorporated into at least part of it is going to be incorporated into H. Half of it stays with the consumers because they pay $4.50 instead of $5, and half of it becomes part of the producer surplus at home. The additional triangle gets divided up in several ways. Part of it stays consumer surplus for the imports because they pay a lower price because $4.50 is still lower than $5. Part of it goes to the government as tariff, and just out of convenience, we want to show that the surplus is no longer consumer surplus, but it's still in the economy. We identify this rectangle here, which is the area over the imports, in this case 35 units, and has a height of 3.50 cents, which is the tariff. And if you go back in here, B and C incorporated part of that, but now we're dividing that B and C into these different pieces. I stays with the consumer. The rectangle in here, which doesn't have a label, now becomes the tariff. And these two pieces, J and K, nobody gets. The easiest one to show you nobody gets is because we went from 135 down to 120. If you don't buy it, yes, you don't have to spend the $4, but you also don't get the surplus benefit. So K is dead and gone, dead weight loss, because nobody's going to buy those units at $4.50. The part J is a little more confusing because it's not transferred to producers as surplus, but it is using resources in the economy to produce these goods, these 10 extra units. And therefore, if you're using the resources in the economy, you're not creating surplus. Surplus is adding resources to the economy. They're just not in the form of capital and labor. They're in the form of profits and satisfaction to the consumers, which make them harder to translate, but it is intended to represent that the economy is doing more with the resources that it had to start with. So that's just the summary of this section, and the book goes into a little more detail, and if you read through that, you should make some sense. The additional parts of this chapter are not hyper important. The graph and the surpluses, if you can go through those three graphs as you would on the homework problem set 2, then you'll have your skill set for test 1.